A happy Thursday. We've got big tech earnings, big earnings week in general. And stay tuned to the end as we're going to share a Fed preview for the Fed meeting, decision, press conference, all the above coming up just next week. My name is Brandon Steele, financial advisor with Mainsail Financial Group here in Bellevue. And our goal every Thursday is to bring to you the market news, data, trends we're watching, hopefully weed out a bit of the noise along the way. I hope everybody's enjoying the week. If you're up here in the Pacific Northwest, we finally have some sunshine. I feel like very well deserved after a long winter. And this weekend, I think here in Bellevue anyways, it's supposed to be almost 80 degrees. So I hope you all are enjoying the sun. And more importantly, this weekend, I hope you're able to get outside and soak up a little heat here. All right, so let's jump into things. And really most of our focus, to be honest with you, this week is going to come towards the latter part of our conversation, where we really break down a little bit of a preview of what's to come next week for the Fed. Before that, let's talk a little bit about some data that's come out the last week or so here. So last Friday, we had consumer confidence down just slightly, or sorry, that was earlier this week. And this was important just because we saw consumer sentiment actually up the previous. Now we see consumer confidence down. So we will, continue to watch that. Again, one of the big legs to this economic stool has been the consumer. And so as long as they are still doing well, things may hold. But if we start to see some cracks there, along with jobs, that could be a challenge. All right. We also had new home sales up. We also had pending home sales come out today. But maybe most importantly, as far as today goes, we had the first read on Q1 2023 GDP. Q1 2023 GDP. And again, this was the first read, so know that there likely will be revisions. But nonetheless, that number came out at 1.1%, growth of 1.1% for the first quarter here this year. This was quite a bit lower than most expected. A lot of expectations were actually north of 2%, some in the 2.5%, and even maybe a little higher. So, we definitely got a pretty negative number here. And, I think this feeds in well to kind of the theme we've been sharing, that there are still some challenges and likely some slowing to continue. A lot of the credit tightening that we've seen from basically about, let's say 6 weeks or so ago, that takes some time to work its way through. And so, Q2 will be very important, and very likely that we may see continued slowing around GDP numbers as we move into Q2 2023. Remember, caveat is markets always are looking ahead. So, that doesn't necessarily mean negative news for markets specifically. But nonetheless, the economy, it will be interesting to see, and it's very likely that we may see some slowing from here. But this week is really all about big tech. So we had Microsoft, Google, Facebook, Boeing. I guess that's not tech, but you get the idea. We have Amazon reporting after the bell today. Basically, big tech company earnings all this week. And so far, here on Thursday, early afternoon, so far, they've all been pretty strong. Especially Microsoft and Google. We saw some good reports come out there. So we will continue to watch this. Now, keep in mind, when companies beat expectations, that doesn't always mean that the earnings are great, right? Because a lot of people have lowered their expectations given what's going on in the economy and the interest rates and all the challenges that we've been talking about. So just keep that in mind. Now, a lot of times prices are based on earnings and future growth expectations. So we can see some adjustments based on that with stock prices. But nonetheless, remember that beating earnings expectations doesn't necessarily mean great things. It just means that company's earnings were stronger than Wall Street expected. Okay, keep that in mind as we kind of continue down this earnings path. Coming up next week, before we get to our main event here today about the Fed coming up, next week we've got PCE numbers, and again, the focus obviously is the Fed. Coming up on May 3rd, I think it is, that's the Wednesday, we will get the Fed decision as well as the press conference to follow. And that is where we're going to kind of divert our attention for the second half of today's conversation, and certainly tune in next Thursday at 3, where we will break down exactly what the Fed shares and what they see ahead. In the meantime, I'll give a little preview of what maybe to expect, maybe more importantly, what to watch. All right. I want to be very clear before I jump into this that we do not have the crystal ball here. And the reality is that the Fed is has done some things that maybe I wouldn't typically agree with looking back over the last 18 months as well. So, or even further, I guess. So keep that in mind. The Fed seems to also do things that may or may not always be best as well. But nonetheless, the Fed is coming up next week, and it is a very important meeting. From time and time again, we have seen the market speculating on this idea that the Fed is going to pivot. And time again, we have seen the Fed continue down the rate hike path that they have spelled out. Coming up next week, I personally do not expect that to be any different than what we've seen. I think that the market has again speculated on the Fed considering a pivot. I think coming up on May 3rd, the Fed will hike 25 basis points. And obviously, all of the nuance is going to be in the conference afterwards. But the decision itself, I think, is going to be a 25 basis point hike. And the reason for that is if we look back, so going back to last month, what I had shared is that this might be the time where they start to consider a pivot if the banking crisis kind of continued and we saw some bigger fallout from that. That was kind of the concern, is did they do too much too quick? What are the ramifications? Now, fast forward a month, what we've seen is that banking crisis really was pretty contained to some degree. Now, what that looks like moving forward obviously remains to be seen, but a lot of that shakeout, is not nearly what many had expected. I mean, we saw some bank earnings come out recently, very strong. So I think that the Fed is much less concerned about that. And here we are still seeing a strong labor market, still seeing high inflation. And I think the Fed is going to at least hike 25 basis points this meeting. Right. So that's kind of where we stand in terms of what we're watching for next week. Now, the nuance of what he shares in the press conference is really where everything lies. The decision itself, of course, if they say they aren't hiking, is a totally different story. If they say they're hiking 50 basis points is a very different story, but I don't see that happening. Assuming they do 25 basis points, the press conference is really what's going to be important to focus on. And what we're really watching for there is he hasn't been very clear on any path to stop, but I think that he will when the time comes. Now, they're always going to leave it with the caveat of we're watching the data, we'll see what happens. But nonetheless, if he shares that they are getting close to an end, or they expect that the next meeting may be the last hike, or this is the last hike, any of that type of language, that's what we really want to pay attention to. I believe the way it stands today that it's likely we see actually 2 more hikes, one in May, one in June. But the conference coming up next week is where I'm going to really be able to adjust that perspective and share what I think. Now, there's a lot of data points between now and then. So to be clear, I think the Fed is watching that and may course correct, but I think they're more focused on making sure they communicate what is going to happen. And so if we hear something saying that the Fed is going to stop in June, that will be important to watch. Again, I don't expect that necessarily, but that's what I'm watching for in the press conference here ahead. And again, June is a long time away, so there certainly could be some change in the meantime. All right, I hope that's helpful. Definitely tune in next Thursday at 3 o'clock, where we will break down what happened as far as the decision, and also what I found in terms of listening to the Fed Chair Powell's press conference afterwards. We'll see you next Thursday at 3. In the meantime, try not to focus on this, enjoy the sunshine, and we will certainly be back next week once we have some more data around the continued earnings season, as well as the Fed decision here on May 3rd. Have a great weekend. See you next Thursday.